All right, now we're going to take our time with these two examples. They're a little bit trickier because they have restricted domains. And let's just take a second to think about what that means. When we report our answers, we're going to have to report all the answers that are between negative 180 and positive 180. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a visual of what that looks like. So we're going to report answers that come from here to here and answers that come from here to here. So let's get started with that. So I have tan theta is equal to square root of 3. Well, if I use the cast rule, I know that tan is positive because that ratio is positive in quadrant 1 and 3. So I'm going to start there. And then we're going to make sure we have our calculator in degree mode. And I'm going to find a reference angle. Second function tan root 3. And that will give me 60 degrees. So I'm just going to erase this. I know that I need to report angles in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3 that have a 60-degree reference angle. In quadrant 1, the rotation angle is simply 60 degrees. But take a look in quadrant 3. We need to report it from this way because our domain says so. I'm not allowed to report this one because that would give me something greater than 180, and that's not in the domain, so I'm going to get rid of that. So this one here, it would be negative 180 if I went all the way to the x-axis. So I'm going to go negative 180 plus 60, and that will give me negative 120 degrees. So again, that was negative 180, and then I'm backing up, so I'm going to add the reference angle, and that gives me negative 120 degrees. And then I double check at the end to make sure both of these angles fit in this domain, and they do. All right, let's take a look at D. We got a lot going on here. Here we have the secant ratio. Whenever I see a reciprocal, I go ahead and I write it as the primary ratio by reciprocating the ratio. So this means the exact same thing as this, and it becomes a lot easier to solve. Now, there's two ways to solve this. If you notice, this is actually a ratio on the unit circle. So if you take a look on the unit circle, you're going to be able to find it and answer part of this question. But if you didn't notice that, we're going to go ahead and we are going to find the reference angle. And there's ways to do that in radians, but what I'm going to get you to do is find the reference angle in degrees. So second function cos root 3 over 2, and your reference angle is going to be 30 degrees. But we have to report the answer in radians, so I want you to go ahead and times that by pi over 180, and we end up with a reference angle of pi over 6. Oh, I forgot to do the quadrant here. Let's go back and take a look at what quadrants I'm allowed to report that answer in. If I'm following the cast rule and it's cosine and it's positive, I know I can report angles in quadrant 1 and 4. So I have a domain of negative 2 pi to 2 pi. So what that means is I'm going to report all the angles in a full positive rotation, and then I'm going to report all the angles in a full negative rotation. So let's draw this with the reference angles in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4 of pi over 6 and get to work with that. I'm going to hit the positive angles first. Let me find a different color. So in quadrant 1, the positive angle is simply the same as the reference angle. So it's pi over 6. If I rotate it all the way to here, to find that rotation angle, I'm going to go 2 pi minus pi over 6, find a common denominator, which would be 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6, and that would give me 11 pi over 6. So there's my first two answers. It's my answers that fall between 0 and 2 pi. Now I got to go do the negative ones. I'm just going to create a new diagram down over here, so it's nice and clean to find the negative ones. So if I take my negative rotation from here and go down, that's going to give me negative pi over 6. And if we go all the way to here, that would be negative 2 pi. So I'm going to go negative 2 pi, and then I'm going to add the rotation angle so we can just back it up a little bit from there. Find a common denominator, so that would be negative 12 pi over 6 plus pi over 6, and that would give us negative 11 pi over 6. And just on a side note, if you did notice that cos of root 3 over 2 is a unit circle angle, you would have found it at pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6, and that would have been perfectly okay to solve it that way. You just would have had to determine the negative rotations from there. All right, class example number 3 is one we've done already, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that one. And I'll come back and I'll help you set up number 4.